The funeral of Mr. Arnold Larch, late of 14th in Church Row, was conducted with such decorum that even the undertaker appeared faintly disappointed. In Flaxborough, a man's passing was expected to generate, if not drama, at least a conversational dividend. But Mr. Larch had been a gentleman of such precise dullness that most mourners, including his widow, could not quite recall what it was he had done for a living. Something to do with railway insurance, it was generally believed, though no one was sure whether he insured the trains or merely the passengers. After the service, the mourners adjourned to the dining room of the Larch residence, where the widow, dressed in a well-rehearsed shade of black, supervised tea and sandwiches. On the mantel stood a portrait of the deceased, a man with an expression suggesting that he had long anticipated this outcome and approved of the timing. "It's all so sudden," murmured Miss Teatley, who said this at every funeral she attended. Regardless of the deceased's age or medical record, Mrs. Larch, who had spent the last 2 months alternately criticizing and consulting her husband's doctor, responded with a modest incline of the head. "He was always particular about his health," she said vaguely, as if good intentions ought to count for something. In a corner of the room stood Mr. Gloss, the family solicitor, a man whose face resembled an unfinished carving. He shuffled through a briefcase with an air of growing discomfort. "Mrs. Larch," he began, clearing his throat in a manner that suggested he'd swallowed a moral dilemma. "I wonder if I might have a word later, perhaps, regarding certain formalities." The widow nodded. "Of course, though I should think Arnold left everything quite in order. He always did." 1 or 2 heads turned at that. Mr. Larch's tidiness was legendary, and so much so that a local draper once claimed he could predict the man's arrival by the sound of his umbrella, snapping open at precisely 2 o'clock each afternoon when the last guest had departed, save for Miss Teatley, who lingered to offer unnecessary help with the washing up. Mr. Gloss requested the use of the study. It was a small, austere room smelling faintly of linseed oil and male self-importance. "I must say, Mrs. Larch," the solicitor began, laying out several envelopes, "I find myself in a rather peculiar situation. The will, you see, appears to be missing." "Missing?" "Mislaid," he amended quickly. "That is to say, not immediately to hand. It was drawn up, signed and witnessed. That much I can affirm." "Indeed, I distinctly remember placing it in our strong-box, and now it isn't there," Mr. Gloss swallowed. "Precisely." Mrs. Larch's expression did not alter, though a faint line appeared at the corner of her mouth, as if she had privately decided whom to blame. "Would this have any bearing," she asked, "on my arrangements?" "Merely a procedural delay," said Gloss, attempting a smile. "We shall, of course, locate it." In due course there followed an awkward silence, filled only by the tick of Mr. Larch's mantel clock, an instrument whose persistence seemed almost reproachful. When Mrs. Larch finally spoke, it was with a faint, almost wistful amusement. "My husband," she said, "was never one to leave things lying about." By evening, the matter was already circulating through the town with all the efficiency of a well-tuned rumour. At the Swan and Trumpet, the landlord's wife informed a customer that the late Mr. Larch had been done out of his will by his nephew in Lincoln. By the time the story reached the hairdresser's 2 hours later, the nephew had forged a new will in favour of a mysterious woman from Nottingham. Inspector Pubright, returning from the station to his modest office on the Market Square, found Sergeant Malley frowning over the day's reports. "Another burglary?" Pubright inquired mildly. "Not quite, sir," said Malley, "though some might call it one in principle. There's talk about a missing will. Chap named Larch, just buried this afternoon." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly like cautious hedgerows. "Ah, a loss of documentation, then. A tragedy not uncommon in our administrative age. Could be something in it, sir." "People say the solicitor's office was broken into last week." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "Do they? Or did the solicitor say so?" Malley hesitated. "Come to think of it, sir, I'm not sure who started it." Purbright smiled faintly. "Then it's probably true enough. in spirit, if not in fact. He reached for his hat, adjusting it to its habitual angle of vague disapproval. Let's pay Mr. Gloss a visit in the morning. If a will has gone missing in Flaxborough, I dare say it won't be long before everyone claims to have seen it. Outside, the church bell tolled 9. Somewhere across the square, the faint laughter of the young, unconcerned, uninvolved, drifted past the shuttered windows, and in the quiet study of 14 Church Row, a locked drawer refused to open. By the next morning, Flaxborough was in its customary state of mild uproar, a condition which, to the uninitiated, might have resembled complete calm. The postmistress, the butcher, and at least 2 churchwardens were all in possession of what each believed to be exclusive information about the late Mr. Larch's will. At precisely 11 o'clock, the Swan and Trumpet, being the most strategically placed establishment for mid-morning refreshment and moral speculation, became the unofficial news bureau. Mrs. Parbury, the landlady, was polishing a brass beer engine with the gravity of a public official when Miss Teatley entered. She was dressed as usual in what appeared to be the uniform of a civilian intelligence service, a sensible coat, gloves, and an expression of highly confidential benevolence. "You've heard, of course," she began without preface, "that the will's gone." Mrs. Parbury did not look up. "So they say." Disappeared right out of Mr. Gloss's strong-box. That's what they're for, isn't it? Keeping things in until someone takes 'em out. Miss Teatley was undeterred. "I heard it from Mrs. Larch's charwoman. Very reliable. Says the whole thing's put her employer in a dreadful state." Mrs. Parbury snorted. "Miss Larch never gets an estate. You could tell her the vicar'd run off with the organist and she'd only ask who was playing on Sunday." "Still," said Miss Teatley, lowering her voice, "they say the nephew's arrived, the one from Lincoln, supposedly to help. Though you and I know what that means." Mrs. Parbury gave a small, approving grunt. Gossip in Flaxborough was not judged by truth or falsity, but by tone and temperature. Miss Teatley's version had the requisite hint of moral disapproval and a touch of scandalous sympathy. Across the room, Mr. Pargeter, a retired draper of impeccable insignificance, pretended to read his newspaper while taking in every syllable. He folded the Daily Clarion with care and ventured to contribute. "Chap like that," he said, "ought to be ashamed. Travelling all the way from Lincoln just to nose about for money. Shows what sort of stock he comes from." Miss Teatley inclined her head modestly as though accepting applause. "Some people will do anything when there's property involved." "Or when they think there might be," added Mrs. Parbury dryly. At that very moment, the door opened and a young man entered. Tallish, neatly dressed, with a face that looked both proud and slightly bruised by circumstance. "That," whispered Miss Teatley, "will be him." It was indeed Mr. Gerald Larch, nephew to the deceased, who had arrived in Flaxborough that morning with the air of a man who believed he was walking into an inheritance, or at least a decent lunch. He ordered a sandwich, glanced around the room with vague disdain, and then sat down by the window, where the sunlight caught the tension in his jaw. Within 10 minutes, half the customers had found excuses to pass within earshot of his table. Mr. Pargeter offered him a paper. Mrs. Parbury asked if he preferred mustard. Miss Teatley, not to be outdone, hovered nearby with a theatrical start of recognition. "Mr. Larch, isn't it? I knew your dear uncle." "Such a loss," Gerald nodded politely. "Quite. Thank you." "I'm sure you'll have a very great deal to attend to." He looked up sharply. "What makes you say that?" "Oh, nothing. Only that people have been wondering about affairs." He gave her a cool stare. "Then people should wonder about their own." That effectively ended Miss Teatley's reconnaissance. She retreated to the bar, stung but invigorated. "Quite the temper," she murmured to Mrs. Parbury. "Shows guilt, if you ask me." At the police station, meanwhile, Inspector Pubright was making a slow study of the morning correspondence. Most of it consisted of circulars from county headquarters and one indignant letter about bicycles on pavements. He had nearly reached the bottom of the pile when Sergeant Malley entered. Message from Mr. Gloss. "Sir," he announced. "Says he's found something." Pubright looked mildly pleased. How enterprising of him. What sort of something?" "Didn't say, sir. Just that he'd be grateful if you could step round." Mr. Gloss's office, located above a haberdashery on Market Street, was as dim and cautious as its occupant. The solicitor rose as Pubright entered, blinking behind spectacles of excessive thickness. "Ah, Inspector, thank you for calling. I thought it best to bring this matter to your attention. You see, last night I discovered this." He produced a small, cracked leather folder from his desk drawer. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, torn along the top edge. Pubright studied it without touching. Part of the missing will? No, nothing so definite. A draft, perhaps. It bears Mr. Larch's signature, but not the date, and there's... Well, an addition. Pubright leaned closer. In faint, uneven handwriting, someone had added a line beneath the typed text. "I wish my estate to be divided according to my conscience." The inspector's eyes rested on the phrase for some time. "That's a most inconvenient instruction, Mr. Gloss. One rarely finds a conscience itemized in probate." "I can't imagine why he wrote it," Gloss said miserably. "Nor when—" "Perhaps," said Pubright, "he was revising his opinions, or his beneficiaries." The solicitor adjusted his tie. "If only we could find the final version, all would be plain." Pubright replaced the folder gently on the desk. "Plainness is overrated, Mr. Gloss. People rarely act from one reason at a time. I find that a will, like its maker, is seldom entirely honest." As he took his leave, Pubright noticed an empty inkwell on the window-sill. An ornate silver piece, its lid slightly ajar. He paused briefly, then said nothing. Outside, the bells of St. Saviour's chimed noon. Across the square, Miss Teatley could already be seen entering the chemist's, her next stop on what might be called the informal network of civic information. By tea-time, the town had settled on its provisional verdict. The will had been stolen. The nephew was greedy, and the widow suspiciously calm. Only Inspector Pubright, walking home beneath the gathering dusk, entertained the more disturbing possibility that no one in Flaxborough had yet told a single truth. The following morning began with the kind of fine, indecisive drizzle that seemed designed for police work, discouraging to the criminally inclined and oddly flattering to the reflective. Inspector Pubright, who was neither easily discouraged nor inclined to reflect aloud, arrived at Mr. Gloss's office shortly before 10. The solicitor's premises occupied the upper half of a Georgian building above a draper's shop. Its sign, H. Gloss & Co., Solicitors and Commissioners for Oaths, suggested both respectability and sleepiness, much like its proprietor. A brass bell tinkled faintly as Pubright entered. A clerk, who looked as though he had been pressed between the pages of a ledger sometime in the late 1930s, emerged from behind a partition. "Mr. Gloss expecting you, sir?" "I rather hope so," said Pubright pleasantly. "If not, we shall surprise each other." He was ushered into a small office that smelled faintly of legal dust and stale tea. Mr. Gloss was standing by the window, inspecting the weather as though it were a complicated affidavit. "Ah, Inspector. Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Gloss. I trust you've recovered from the shock of yesterday." The solicitor gave a feeble smile. "I fear my constitution is not equal to drama, Inspector. Still, I suppose one must face such irregularities when they occur." Pubright seated himself carefully. "Irregularities do seem to favour the conscientious, don't they? You mentioned yesterday that the will had been locked away in your strong-box. Indeed, yes. That was my understanding. And may I ask who had access to that strong-box?" Gloss hesitated. "Myself, naturally. And my clerk, Mr. Tripp, though only when necessary. I did once allow Mr. Larch to examine his will here in the office, purely at his request." "When was that?" "Let me see. About 3 months ago. He had come to inquire whether certain charitable bequests might be advisable. I believe he was considering the Society for the Preservation of War Memorials. Very civic-minded, said Pubright mildly.
And did he alter anything at that time?
Gloss frowned.
Not that I recall.
He merely asked questions. Then you replaced the will in the strongbox yourself? Immediately, yes. And locked it? The solicitor blinked, as though the notion of locking was somehow personal. Of course. I am always most particular about such matters. Pubright nodded, looking about the office. On one wall hung a sepia photograph of a cricket team. On another, an enormous calendar bearing the name of a local printer who had died 12 years before. The silver inkwell on the windowsill gleamed faintly through the drizzle. "You keep a handsome inkwell," said Pubright conversationally. Gloss looked startled.
Eh? Oh, that? Yes, it belonged to my father. A family piece. It must have witnessed a good many signatures. Quite so. Pubright rose and strolled to the window, peering down at the damp street below.
"Mr. Gloss," he said gently, "does it strike you as curious that a man of Mr. Larch's tidiness should allow his will to vanish so unceremoniously?" The solicitor sighed. "It has kept me awake, I assure you. But these things do happen. Paperwork, Inspector, even the best of it, has an unfortunate tendency to elude control." "Human nature shares that weakness," Pubright murmured. A knock came at the door. The clerk, Mr. Tripp, entered, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea and the resigned air of a man accustomed to being ignored. His cuffs were frayed, and his eyes had the dull brightness of perpetual apology. "Set it there, Tripp," said Gloss absently. "Yes, sir." Pubright regarded him with mild curiosity. "Mr. Tripp, how long have you been with the firm?" 22 years, sir. Since Mr. Gloss's father's day." "Then you'd know where most things are kept?" Tripp looked pained. "In a general way, sir, yes. But I don't go poking about unless told. Mr. Gloss don't hold with rummaging." "An admirable rule," said Pubright. "Did you happen to notice anything unusual in the past few weeks?"
Visitors, perhaps.
Tripp hesitated, glancing at his employer. "Well, there was a gentleman came one evening, after hours."
Asked for Mr. Gloss. I told him the office was closed. Gloss frowned.
"Yes, I remember. A man from Lincoln, I believe. Said he was an acquaintance of Mr. Larch's. I saw him briefly." Pubright turned. "The nephew?" Possibly. Though he gave his name as Merrick. Did he seem satisfied?" Gloss's lips twitched. He seemed inquisitive. Asked whether Mr. Larch had made provision for anyone outside the family. When I declined to discuss the matter, he departed rather abruptly. Was that before or after Mr. Larch's death?"
After, said Gloss slowly.
2 days after. Then he must have been remarkably well informed. There was a pause. Gloss stirred his tea but did not drink it.
It's all very irregular, Inspector.
"I do wish the whole business could be resolved quietly. Mrs. Larch is an estimable woman, and the nephew, though perhaps—"
Impetuous, seems genuinely distressed. Pubright smiled faintly.
"People are always distressed, Mr. Gloss. It's the motive behind the distress that interests me." He rose and replaced his hat. "I won't trouble you further for now. If the missing will reappears, please send word. Meanwhile, I should like to speak with Mrs. Larch again at her convenience." "Of course," said Gloss, relieved. "I shall cooperate in any way possible." As Pubright descended the stairs, the sound of his footsteps mingled with the distant patter of rain. In the street below, a delivery van splashed past, leaving behind a reflection of the solicitor's window, the faint shimmer of silver on the sill. At the police station that afternoon, Sergeant Malley met him with a report. "You were right about the nephew, sir. He's registered at the Hotel Royal under the name G. Larch. Been asking questions round town." Pubright placed his hat carefully on the stand. A man who asks too many questions, Malley, is usually afraid of the answers. "Think he took the will, sir?" Pubright smiled thinly.
I try not to think prematurely, Sergeant.
"It upsets the evidence." He opened his notebook, where, under the heading Larch Case, he wrote 3 short lines, Mr. Gloss. "Too tidy, Mrs. Larch, too calm. Nephew, too early." He regarded the list for a moment, then added a final note beneath it, inkwell. Then, closing the notebook, he murmured, "Always. It begins with something small." Inspector Pubright preferred not to summon people to the station unless absolutely necessary. He found that most citizens were inclined to reveal more in the comfort of their own chosen surroundings, particularly if they thought the police were being considerate. Thus, late that afternoon, he strolled to the Hotel Royal, whose red velvet drapes and faint smell of boiled haddock made it the natural habitat for visiting relatives of deceased gentlemen. The receptionist, a girl with a complexion like powdered chalk and the composure of a churchwarden's niece, directed him to room 12. "Mr. Larch is in, sir," she said, in the tone of one reporting that the weather had taken a turn for the worse. Pubright ascended the stairs at his usual pace, unhurried, reflective, and knocked gently. The door opened to reveal Gerald Larch, still in his funeral black, though the tie now hung at a mutinous angle. His expression was that of a man who had been thinking intensely and with unsatisfactory results. "Inspector," he said stiffly, "I was wondering when you'd come." "Then you'll be spared the suspense," Pubright replied mildly. "May I?" The room was neat, though not by nature. One could sense that its occupant had been tidying in self-defense. A small suitcase lay open on the bed, its contents arranged with theatrical precision, socks folded, shirts stacked like manifestos. On the writing table, however, stood a half-empty whiskey glass and an open notebook. Purbright's gaze lingered there only briefly before he seated himself. "I understand you were close to your uncle," he began. Gerald laughed, a sharp,
self-conscious sound. "Close, hardly.
The old man hadn't written to me in years."
Still family's family, indeed."
"And yet you came to Flaxborough immediately upon hearing of his death." "I was notified by Mr. Gloss, or rather, I was told that Mr. Gloss had written, though the letter only arrived after the funeral. Seems to be a pattern of misplacing things in this town." Pubright inclined his head. "And what do you intend to do now?"
"That depends, doesn't it? On whether the will turns up."
"You have expectations, then?"
Gerald hesitated.
"I'm his only blood relative. Surely that counts for something?" "In probate matters," said Pubright gently, "it counts for everything or nothing, depending on the temperament of the deceased." The young man flushed slightly. "You think I wanted his money?" "I think," said Pubright, "that most people prefer to be remembered, and that money is the usual proof of remembrance." Gerald's gaze shifted toward the notebook on the desk, as though it had been following the conversation with particular interest. Pubright rose, walked toward the window, and observed, without directly looking, that the notebook bore faint indentations on the top sheet, the ghost of writing pressed through. "Do you write, Mr. Larch?"
"Notes," Gerald said quickly.
"Things to do, people to see. I've been trying to put my uncle's affairs in order." "Admirable," said Pubright. "Might I see what kind of order you prefer?" The young man hesitated, then shut the notebook with a snap. "It's private." "Of course," said Pubright, returning to his chair.
"Privacy is the soul of confidence and of deceit." Gerald looked up sharply.
"You suspect me?" "I find suspicion a waste of energy," Pubright said mildly. "Observation suffices." The silence that followed was long enough to suggest reflection, but not quite long enough for remorse. Finally, Gerald said, "You think I came here sniffing after a will. But you don't understand."
"My uncle, he wasn't a fool, but he was
"Eccentric."
I thought he'd made certain promises." "To whom?"
"To me, years ago. Said he'd see me set up properly after his time."
"I believed him."
"Wouldn't you? Belief is rarely the problem," said Pubright.
"It's remembering what exactly one believed that causes trouble." Gerald laughed again, more bitterly this time.
"You'd get on with him, Inspector." "You both speak in riddles," Pubright smiled. "Only when the truth seems impolite." He rose to go. As he reached the door, he turned back. "One more thing. You visited Mr. Gloss after your uncle's death, I believe? The young man's eyes flickered. Who told you that? Mr. Gloss. He said you inquired about the will. I wanted to be sure there was one. And did you find out?
No, Gerald said quickly.
He was evasive. Solicitors often are, Pubright observed. They prefer not to commit themselves, except in writing, which is what makes this case rather interesting. He paused, then added with faint curiosity, Tell me, Mr. Larch, do you own a fountain pen?
Yes, why? No reason, said Pubright, already halfway out the door.
Merely a passing interest in instruments of expression. When he had gone, Gerald exhaled and sat heavily on the bed. His eyes went to the notebook, still lying where it was. Slowly, he opened it. The top sheet was blank save for a single line written in uneven block capitals. Find the copy, not the original. He tore it out, crumpled it, and dropped it into the bin. But he did not notice that the indentation, faint and ghostly, remained visible on the next page. That evening, as the rain gave way to a watery sunset, Pubright and Sergeant Malley shared tea in the police office. Gloss insists the will was signed and witnessed, Malley reported. Says he even saw Larch seal it in an envelope, Pubright nodded thoughtfully. And yet the envelope has vanished. Curious, isn't it, how paper disappears more readily than people? Malley frowned.
You think someone destroyed it?
Destroyed, concealed, or replaced. Those are our traditional categories. He stirred his tea, then added, Mr. Larch's nephew owns a fountain pen, Malley, a silver one, I suspect. I should like you to find out whether the ink in it happens to match that used in Mr. Gloss's office. Right, sir. For handwriting comparison? Pubright smiled.
No, for curiosity's sake.
Curiosity is our only dependable witness. He leaned back, gazing out at the glistening cobbles of Market Square. Somewhere beyond, in a quiet hotel room, a young man sat staring at a blank notebook. And in a solicitor's office, his silver inkwell gleamed faintly in the dusk. Its lid once again ajar, Mrs. Larch had never been one to dramatize her emotions, largely because she found other people's attempts at drama vulgar. Her grief, therefore, was conducted with the same restraint she had once applied to flower arranging, tasteful, economical, and requiring no assistance. It was for this reason that her sudden appearance one damp evening on Flaxborough High Street, carrying a shopping basket and wearing her best black hat, caused more discussion than any number of tears might have done. She goes out every evening, you know, said Miss Teatley confidentially to Mrs. Parbury, at the Swan and Trumpet, same time, same direction, always toward the churchyard, and disappears behind the vicarage wall. Praying, maybe, Mrs. Parbury suggested. At that hour? Don't be absurd. It's hardly decent to pray in the dark. The idea of nocturnal devotion was promptly discarded, and by supper time half the town had agreed that Mrs. Larch was meeting someone. The identity of that someone shifted hourly, first the vicar, then the milkman, and by morning the solicitor himself, Inspector Pubright, to whom gossip arrived like unsolicited evidence, read the latest installment of speculation with mild amusement over his breakfast. The note came from Sergeant Malley, who had attached a map of the widow's evening routes with 3 possible destinations circled. Efficient of you, Malley, Pubright remarked, though I wonder what conclusion the cartography department intends me to draw, that grief is best expressed by circular motion. Malley grinned. Thought you might want to see where she goes, sir. Folks say she stops by the churchyard, then walks on to the post office, after it's closed. Ah, a romantic rendezvous with the pillar box, perhaps. That evening, Pubright decided to take his own walk, purely to observe, he told himself, though the inspector's brand of observation generally led him into something quietly instructive. Flaxborough after dark was a soft, watery place, its gas lamps humming faintly, its puddles reflecting genteel decay. At 7:30 precisely, Mrs. Larch emerged from her house in Church Row. She walked briskly, her posture upright, her black gloves immaculate. Pubright followed at a distance, admiring the precision with which she crossed the square, not furtive, yet oddly purposeful. She paused first at the church gate, looking in toward the shadowy graves. Then, after a few moments, she continued up the lane to a small, disused building beside the vicarage, the old schoolroom, long since turned into storage for hymn books and parish miscellanea. To Purbright's mild surprise, she unlocked the door with a small key and stepped inside. No light showed. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At last, she reappeared, locked the door again, and began her walk home, passing within 20 yards of where Purbright stood. Her expression was calm, almost relieved. When she had gone, he strolled casually to the schoolroom door. The padlock was new, the keyhole polished from recent use. He made a note of the number stamped on the lock, then walked away without trying it. Back at the station, Mally looked up expectantly. "Find anything, sir?" "Only a lady taking comfort in old buildings," said Purbright. "We mustn't be unkind. Even widows need secrets." He hung his hat on its peg, then added quietly, "Still, have a word with the vicar tomorrow. Ask him whether Mrs. Larch has permission to use the schoolroom after hours, and whether anyone else does." The next morning brought a letter, not from Mrs. Larch, but for her. It arrived at the police station by mistake, redirected from the post office by an overzealous temporary clerk. Purbright, intending to send it on unopened, could not help but notice the return address on the back, H. Gloss & Cohen Solicitors. He handed it to Mally.
"Kindly deliver this to Mrs. Larch yourself, Sergeant. No need for conversation, more or less, of course."
Conversation insists on happening. Mally, who had a talent for being politely unobtrusive, returned an hour later looking faintly perplexed. "She wasn't surprised to see it, sir. Said she'd been expecting something from Gloss, but didn't open it while I was there. Seemed pleased, though." "Pleased," murmured Purbright. That's an underused expression in widowhood. Later that day, Purbright paid another visit to Mr. Gloss, who greeted him with the air of a man half expecting either forgiveness or arrest. "I've just sent a letter to Mrs. Larch," the solicitor said quickly, before the inspector could speak. "Purely business. Copies of certain financial statements she requested." "Indeed," said Purbright, eyeing the desk.
"And you found time to type them yourself?"
Gloss flushed slightly. "My clerk was out. Busy evening." Gloss coughed. "We had some backlog." Purbright nodded thoughtfully, then allowed his gaze to fall once more on the inkwell by the window. The lid, as always, was slightly ajar. "Tell me, Mr. Gloss," he said, "do you often work late?" "On occasion." "Why do you ask?" "Only because I admire diligence," Purbright replied. "And because one of your clients appears to share it? Mrs. Larch seems to make nocturnal visits to the old schoolroom." Gloss's eyes flickered.
"Ah, yes."
"That would be in connection with the late Mr. Larch's papers, I imagine. He kept some parish documents there, minutes of meetings and so forth. How thorough of her to tidy up after death as well as life." Gloss shifted uneasily.
"If you're implying something, Inspector—" "I never imply," said Purbright.
"I merely enjoy coincidences. They have such an attractive sense of design." He took his leave, leaving behind the faint scent of damp wool and unanswered questions. That night, Mrs. Larch again made her evening walk, unaware that the street lamps, the drizzle, and an unseen inspector conspired to watch her. But this time she carried no basket, only a thin folder tied with string. When she reached the old schoolroom, she did not enter. Instead, she slipped the folder through a narrow gap between the door and frame and walked away quickly, her pace almost defiant. Purbright waited until she had turned the corner, then stepped forward and tried the door. Still locked. But on the ground lay a scrap of paper torn from the folder's edge, a fragment bearing 2 faintly inked words. "Final version." He folded it carefully into his notebook. "Ah," murmured Purbright. so the deceased was not the only one to keep things properly filed. There are, in every investigation, moments when evidence behaves like a shy cat, visible only when ignored. Inspector Pubright had learned long ago that the less one chases after significance, the more obligingly it strolls into view. By the morning of the third day, significance had chosen to appear in the form of a small silver inkwell. It was Sergeant Malley who brought it up first. "I did what you said, sir. Checked the nephew's fountain pen. Nice bit of silverwork, old-fashioned lever type. The ink inside was blue-black. You'll never guess what sort they use at Gloss's office." "I prefer not to," said Pubright mildly. "Same sort, sir. Pelican blue-black.
Rare brand, apparently.
The chemist says only 2 bottles sold in the last year." "Indeed?" Purbright's tone suggested polite gratitude to the universe for its small, symmetrical gifts. "One assumes Mr. Gloss bought one?" "Yes, sir. For the office. The other bottle was sold to the hotel. Stationery desk for guest use." Pubright looked faintly amused. "Then Flaxborough is, in effect, united by ink. How very appropriate." He rose from his desk, brushed a faint film of dust from his sleeve, and took up his hat. "Come along, Malley. Let us pay another social call on Mr. Gloss. We must admire his family heirloom more closely." The solicitor greeted them with a nervous cheerfulness that had clearly been practiced in front of a
mirror. "Inspector Sergeant."
"How very good to see you again."
"I was just working."
Pubright supplied helpfully. "You do seem industrious, Mr. Gloss. I'm told you keep the late hours of a novelist." Gloss flushed. "There's rather a lot of correspondence to attend to." "Yes," said Pubright. "Some of it to widows, I believe. We were curious. Does your typist also work late?" "My typist? Good heavens, no. She leaves at 5. Then you type your own letters after hours?" Gloss hesitated. "If necessary." Pubright glanced toward the desk where the inkwell sat, as usual, slightly ajar, a polite, mechanical yawn.
"And do you still use that handsome piece for your correspondence?"
"I beg your pardon?" "The inkwell," said Pubright gently.
"It's a fine thing. I can't help but notice it always seems active." Gloss blinked. "Active? Not decorative," Pubright explained.
"In constant use. The lid ajar, the nib marks round the rim. Signs of habitual attention." "I suppose I do use it," Gloss admitted. "Old habits," said Pubright softly, "are the only reliable ones." He strolled to the window. "Tell me, Mr. Gloss, when you type letters, do you also sign them in ink?"
"Of course. Blue-black, perhaps?"
"Yes, naturally." "Excellent." Pubright smiled, but the smile was not one to reassure. "And you won't mind if we ask to see the pen you use for such formalities?" Gloss's composure wavered. "Really, Inspector, just to confirm a minor detail," Pubright continued pleasantly, "we're tracing a certain brand of ink, a technical curiosity." Reluctantly, Gloss opened a drawer and produced a silver fountain pen, the twin in design to Gerald Larch's. Pubright examined it closely. The cap bore a faint scratch, one that had been hastily polished but not quite erased. "May I?" he asked. "Be my guest," said Gloss, though his tone suggested that hospitality had its limits. Pubright unscrewed the cap, dipped the nib lightly in the inkwell, and drew it out. "Blue-black indeed. You know, Mr. Gloss, it's remarkable how uniform certain inks appear, until they dry." He took from his pocket a small slip of paper. "This was found outside the old schoolroom, the torn edge of a document. I wondered whether you could identify the hand." Gloss leaned forward.
"Where did you—" "Near where Mrs. Larch has been walking," Pubright said evenly.
"At night," the solicitor swallowed. "Then she must have been retrieving some of her husband's papers." "Or delivering them," said Pubright. "The fragment reads, 'Final version.' Not an encouraging phrase for a man whose will has gone astray." Gloss tried a laugh. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," said Pubright, returning the paper to his pocket. "But I find it interesting that Mrs. Larch knew which lock to use at the schoolroom, and that the padlock there matches those supplied by your firm." "Pure coincidence." "Flaxborough," said Pubright dryly, "is a village built upon coincidence. Yet somehow they all seem to fit together rather neatly." After leaving the office, Pubright and Mally walked the short distance to the chemist's. The proprietor, a man of infinite discretion and infinite curiosity, produced the record of ink sales without protest. 2 bottles, Inspector. One to Mr. Gloss, last winter.
The other just 3 weeks ago. Sold to a lady. A lady?
Yes, Mrs. Larch, of Church Row. Said her husband always used that shade. Pubright pocketed the information with quiet satisfaction.
Thank you.
I'm sure the colour suited him. That evening, over tea and a remarkably dry sandwich, Mally looked puzzled. Can't see what difference the ink makes, sir.
Everyone writes with something. Quite so, said Pubright.
But only certain people rewrite. You mean forgery? I mean correction, said Pubright, sipping his tea. Forgery is too vulgar a term for Flaxborough. Here we improve upon the truth, modestly, in good penmanship, and with the proper ink. He set down his cup. Suppose a will was rewritten not to enrich but to simplify. Suppose someone found the deceased's original, full of awkward instructions, and produced a cleaner version, one more convenient for all concerned. Mally frowned. But that need a solicitor's help. Yes, said Pubright, and perhaps a widow's motive, not greed, but gratitude. You think she and Gloss? Pubright held up a hand. We think nothing yet, but tomorrow we shall see whether Mrs. Larch's conscience dries the same shade of blue-black as her solicitor's. He rose, replaced his hat, and smiled faintly. Matter of silver ink, Sergeant. One must appreciate refinement in crime. It helps distinguish Flaxborough from mere burglary. That night, long after the lamps were out, the window of Mr. Gloss's office glowed faintly. Inside, the solicitor sat before his desk, the silver inkwell open, the lid gleaming in the lamplight. He dipped his pen once, hesitated, then began to write. To whom it may concern, halfway through the line he stopped, listening. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps rose from the stairwell below. He blotted the paper quickly, replaced the inkwell lid, and waited. Then came the knock, soft, polite.
Unmistakable, Mr. Gloss, said Purbright's voice through the door.
I wonder if we might continue our conversation just a little further. The solicitor's hand trembled slightly. He looked down at the blotter. Beneath the faint, glistening words, a small splash of blue-black ink spread like guilt itself. If Inspector Pubright had one rule of thumb, it was that the appearance of strangers in Flaxborough was rarely accidental. People either came by train with respectable luggage and perfectly ordinary lies, or by bus with no luggage and lies that were more interesting. The stranger who arrived that Wednesday noon was of the first variety. He was a tidy, middle-aged man in a grey raincoat, who introduced himself at the Hotel Royal as Mr. Peveril, commercial traveller for a stationery firm. This, in Flaxborough, was roughly equivalent to saying one was a spy. The receptionist, who had already seen more stationery travellers than she had stationery, wrote down the name with appropriate caution. Yes, sir. Room 10, breakfast from 7. Splendid, said Peveril. His voice was smooth, provincial, and just uncertain enough to suggest rehearsal. That evening, after dining alone, he sat in the hotel lounge with a small notebook and an air of professional harmlessness. Yet it did not escape him that he was being watched, not by the guests, who had retreated to their puddings, but by Gerald Larch, seated across the room with a whisky and a fixed expression of brittle calm. Eventually Gerald crossed over. "You're new to Flaxborough," Peveril smiled pleasantly.
So it would appear. Sales, is it? Stationery, indeed.
Paper, pens, inks, ledgers are the sinews of civilization. Then you'd know something about documents, Gerald said.
Almost too quickly. I suppose I would, said Peveril, his eyes friendly but alert.
Do you require any particular kind? Gerald's laugh came out too sharp.
No, I was thinking of my uncle's will. Ah, family business.
You could call it that. Peveril nodded, as if filing the remark away for later inspection. I've heard about the affair. Small towns make efficient telegraphs. Gerald stared at him.
And what's it to you?
Nothing. said Peveril mildly. "I merely notice what's noticed." The conversation ended there, but when Gerald left the lounge, Peveril's notebook received another brief, careful entry. G. Larch, nervous. Speaks of missing will. Must verify solicitor's story. The following morning, Pubright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Malley in quiet triumph. "Guess what, sir? There's another new guest at the Royal. Calls himself Peveril. Says he's selling ink and paper. But I checked. The firm name he gave, Fielding and Howe, doesn't exist." Pubright smiled faintly.
How gratifying.
"Flaxborough's becoming quite the social destination. You want me to speak to him?" "Not yet. Let's see whether he approaches us, which would show either guilt or intelligence." By midday, intelligence had won. Peveril appeared at the police station, hat in hand, his expression the picture of deferential cooperation.
"Inspector Pubright."
"I believe we have mutual interests." "Do we indeed?" Pubright said, gesturing him to a chair. "I'm making certain discreet inquiries," Peveril said carefully. "Private ones. I represent a London firm handling estates and trusts. We were informed of irregularities concerning the late Mr. Arnold Larch." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "How unusually conscientious of London to take notice of our little town's paperwork." "Mr. Larch," said Peveril, "was once a client of a connected agency. He invested a considerable sum through them. When the will was reported missing, the agency grew."
Anxious. Anxious about what?
"About who might inherit, or who might not." Pubright regarded him mildly.
"And you have credentials, of course?"
Peveril produced a card embossed with a crest so blandly respectable it could only be genuine. Pubright studied it, nodded once, and returned it. "Very good. Then you must have some theory of your own." "Only that the will exists," said Peveril, "and that someone is concealing it for leverage. My employers would prefer it found before the newspapers become interested." "How thoughtful of them. And how curious that you choose to lodge at the same hotel as the deceased's nephew." Peveril smiled thinly. "You know, Inspector, coincidences are rather overrepresented in Flaxborough." Purbright's eyes twinkled. "Yes, we breed them locally." That evening, while Pubright wrote a cautious report for county headquarters, no disorder, only deceit, Sergeant Malley knocked softly and entered with a sheet of notepaper. "From the hotel maid, sir." "Found this in Mr. Peveril's wastebasket." Pubright unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, businesslike, and written in blue-black ink. It read, "Gloss, confirmed destruction.
"Widow still uncertain."
Nephew volatile. Proceed cautiously," Malley exhaled.
"So he's part of it?"
Pubright tapped the page thoughtfully. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he's the only one who isn't." "You mean—"
"I mean, Sergeant, that Flaxborough appears to be hosting not one, but two investigations, one conducted by us and one by someone who doesn't entirely trust our suspects either." He leaned back.
"We mustn't interrupt him just yet. Let's see who reports to whom." Late that night, Peveril left the hotel by the side entrance and walked briskly through the drizzle to Market Street. A dim light showed in the solicitor's office. He tapped twice on the glass pane, waited, then entered. Mr. Gloss stood by the desk, pale.
"Hat in hand. You shouldn't have come," he whispered. "Then you shouldn't have written," said Peveril quietly.
"Your letter to the widow was intercepted." "Amateur work, Gloss." "I only told her to remain calm." "Yes, well, calm people are suspicious, especially when they're guilty." "I've done nothing wrong." Peveril regarded him steadily. "You forged a will, or helped to do it." "Don't waste my time." Gloss looked stricken.
No, I only corrected it."
He'd written such confused instructions. "Exactly," said Peveril. "You corrected it, simplified it, and now someone's realized there's a copy missing."
"Where is it?" "I don't know."
"Then you'd better remember, because if I find it first, I'll make sure the police know who handled the ink." The solicitor sagged. "You don't understand. She only wanted to spare his name."
"There were things in it." "What things?"
Gloss hesitated. "A reference to someone in Nottingham, a woman."
"Not his wife." Peveril's face tightened.
"And that's the motive."
"Not money or discretion." At that precise moment, a polite knock came from the outer door. Peveril turned, annoyed. "Who the devil—" "Inspector Pubright," came the calm voice.
"You seem to be conducting interviews after hours again, Mr. Gloss. Shall I wait, or shall we all talk together?" Gloss froze. Peveril looked as though he'd been caught mid-performance. Pubright entered, hat in hand, expression as tranquil as Sunday tea. "Good evening, gentlemen."
"I do hope I'm not intruding on confidential stationery business." Peveril's mouth twitched.
"You have a remarkable sense of timing, Inspector." "It's one of the few things we're punctual about in Flaxborough," said Pubright. "Now perhaps one of you would care to explain why a salesman from London and a solicitor from Market Street are corresponding about a widow's conscience." The two men exchanged looks. Then Gloss, defeated, sat heavily at his desk. "It wasn't supposed to be criminal," he murmured. "Only tidy," Pubright smiled faintly. "That, Mr. Gloss, is what everyone says, just before it becomes criminal." Flaxborough Police Station after dark had a peculiarly meditative air. The gas lamps hissed faintly. The sound of distant rain on the tiled roof gave the illusion of company. In his small, paper-burdened office, Inspector Pubright sat motionless, his teacup long since cooled, his eyes resting not on any document, but on the indifferent flicker of the desk lamp. There were no news statements to read, no confessions to consider. What there was, as ever, was a collection of minds, each ticking at its own rhythm, producing noise that only appeared to be silence. He opened his notebook, where the earlier observations were still neatly written. Mr. Gloss, too tidy. Mrs. Larch, too calm. Nephew, too early. Inkwell. He regarded the words a while, then added, in his small, deliberate hand, stranger, too informed. He replaced the pen, leaned back, and allowed his thoughts to wander in the slow, dry pattern that was their natural gait. Flaxborough, he reflected, was not a town where evil shouted. It preferred to cough discreetly into its handkerchief. Its inhabitants sinned tidily, spoke gently, and left their footprints in the moral dust only by accident. Mr. Gloss, a solicitor of the old school, had clearly convinced himself that a small forgery was an act of piety rather than crime. The widow, calm, decorous, ever dignified, had accepted the alteration not out of greed, but to protect her late husband's name. And the nephew, poor nervous Gerald, had been made to look like the grasping fool, convenient for everyone, including himself. It was, Pubright decided, a very English conspiracy. Everyone involved had done wrong, but only in the nicest possible way. The difficulty,
as always, was the truth. That faint, elusive thing which only revealed itself when the dust settled from moral justifications. He rose,
poured the dregs of his tea into the bin, and paced slowly before the window. Outside, the market square was empty, lit by 3 yellow lamps whose reflections trembled in the wet cobbles. He thought of the letter intercepted at the post office. Gloss, confirmed destruction.
Widow still uncertain.
Nephew volatile. Destruction of what? The original will, no doubt. Yet that raised a more subtle question. Why had it needed destroying? The Nottingham connection mentioned by Gloss hovered at the edge of his thoughts. A woman, unnamed, unspoken. Was she a beneficiary?
A secret? A mistake?
He imagined the dead man at his desk, writing his final version, full of penitence and pride, then reconsidering, as English gentlemen did, whether decency might be more comfortably served by omission. Perhaps the real crime was not greed, but correction. The attempt to tidy away the inconvenient truths of love. Pubright smiled faintly. "There's no document so dangerous," he murmured, "as one written honestly." The door opened softly. Sergeant Malley entered with the cautious tread of a man approaching both wisdom and trouble. "Evening, sir. Thought you'd still be here." "Habit, Malley," said Pubright. It's how we pass for dedicated. Mally set down a small envelope. From the postmaster, came late. Addressed to Mrs. Larch, but with no sender's name. Pubright examined it. The paper was cream, expensive. The handwriting was firm, slanted, unmistakably masculine, and in blue-black ink. He slit it open with his penknife and read, silently, "Eleanor, you need say nothing. The matter will be closed tomorrow.
I cannot keep the copy.
Too great a risk." "Destroy it, H," murmured Pubright. "For Henry Gloss, one presumes," Mally frowned. "She's still got the copy, then?" "Or she's burned it," said Pubright. "Either way, someone believes the problem will end tomorrow." "Think they're meeting?" "I do," said Pubright. "And I think they've both run out of tidy solutions." He placed the letter carefully on his desk, weighed down with the handle of his magnifying glass. "Tomorrow, Sergeant, you'll arrange a quiet presence near the old schoolroom. Nothing overt. Just eyes. You think she'll go there again?" Pubright smiled faintly. "She's been going there every night since her husband's funeral. And now she has one last thing to deliver." After Mally left, Pubright remained seated a long while, listening to the hum of the building, the old timbers creaking like the conscience of Flaxborough itself. His mind drifted, not to the case, but to the curious uniformity of human intention. No one ever believed themselves wicked. Mr. Gloss thought he was being protective. Mrs. Larch believed she was defending her husband's reputation. Peveril, the London salesman, had convinced himself he was preserving corporate integrity. Each of them was both innocent and guilty, as most people were, depending on which sentence you stopped the story. Pubright smiled ruefully. "We really ought to print that on the station's letterhead." He wrote one more note in his book. "Tomorrow, the widow's walk. Observe, no intervention until the key turns." He capped his pen, extinguished the lamp, and paused in the doorway. For a moment he looked back at the darkened office, the single patch of moonlight on his desk where the inkwell glimmered faintly. He found himself almost superstitious about it, that little well of colour. It seemed to have flowed through every corner of the case, linking the solicitor's desk, the widow's stationery, the nephew's notebook, even the stranger's report. "Blue-black," he murmured. "Not quite one thing or the other." Then after a pause he smiled. "Like people." He locked the door and went home. Outside, the church clock struck 11. Steady, respectable, and entirely unaware that somewhere across town, Mrs. Eleanor Larch was again putting on her gloves. There are two kinds of visitors in Flaxborough, those who come by appointment and those who arrive with a sense of destiny. Miss Teatley belonged firmly to the latter category. At 10 minutes past 9 the following morning, she swept into the police station with her hat askew and her sense of importance at full sail. The constable on duty, recognizing the signs, made the only tactical decision available to him. "I'll just see if the inspector's free."
"Miss, he will be," said Miss Teatley confidently. She was not wrong.
Inspector Pubright, being of philosophical disposition, never refused Miss Teatley entry. He had discovered that one learned more from her monologues than from most people's confessions. She entered, gloved hands neatly folded, expression both mournful and triumphant. "Good morning, Inspector. I dare say you've heard what's happened." "I dare say I haven't," said Pubright pleasantly. "Please enlighten me." Miss Teatley sat primly, her voice adopting the hushed gravity usually reserved for royal scandals. "The widow Larch has had a visitor last night."
"A man, not from the town. Mrs. Parbury saw him leave just after 9.
"Handsome in a rather improper way. She says his coat was damp." "Rain does tend to produce that effect," said Pubright. "Did Mrs. Parbury recognize him?" "She did not, though she said he had an air of business."
"And that he looked at the house as though it owed him money." Purbright's brows rose slightly. "Fascinating."
"Anything else?" Well, I happened to call on Mrs. Larch this morning, quite by chance, of course, and she seemed unusually calm.
Almost empty, if you understand me. I shall make a noble effort, said Pubright.
Did she mention a visitor? No, but there was a faint smell of ink in the sitting room.
Very distinctive.
Reminded me of my late father's study.
He was fond of correspondence, Pubright looked up sharply. Ink, you say?
Blue-black, Miss Teatley said, with the certainty of a woman who could identify moral shades as easily as physical ones. A blot on the edge of her writing table, too, the inspector nodded slowly. You have, Miss Teatley, an enviable faculty for useful irrelevance. Thank you, Inspector, she said, taking it as a compliment. I always try to be of assistance. You succeed admirably, Pubright replied. When she had gone, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and moral superiority, Pubright sat for a long moment, tapping his pencil against the desk. Then he called for Sergeant Malley. Sir, we've just received a report, said Pubright, from one of our more active branches of the local intelligence network. The widow received a visitor last night, likely Mr. Gloss or his friend from London.
I want to know which, right, sir. Also, Pubright added, you'll accompany me this evening.
The schoolroom quietly, expecting trouble. Flaxborough rarely does trouble, Malley.
Only embarrassment. That afternoon,
Pubright paid a short call on Mrs. Larch. She received him with the grave civility of one who accepted the presence of police officers as a social inconvenience. I trust there's been some progress. Inspector, she said, leading him into the parlour. Mr. Gloss assures me the matter is nearly settled. Ah, said Pubright. Did he visit you last night to say so? Her gloved hands twitched slightly. He did call, yes. He was kind enough to bring certain papers related to your husband's affairs? To the conclusion of them, yes. Pubright nodded, gazing toward the writing table. A sheet of paper lay half-folded, still glistening faintly with fresh ink. The air carried that distinct scent, metallic and intimate. Do you mind if I ask what became of the schoolroom key, Mrs. Larch? She looked startled.
The key? Yes, the one you've been using in the evenings. Oh, that?
I've returned it to the vicar. It served no further purpose. Did? Said Pubright softly. And what purpose did it serve before? She met his gaze evenly.
Tidying away certain
private matters. My husband kept old records there.
I felt they should not be left, Pubright smiled faintly.
You have a great respect for order, Mrs. Larch, almost as much as your late husband. That's kind of you to say. He inclined his head politely, then excused himself. Outside, Sergeant Malley was waiting across the road. Well, sir? She's lying, said Pubright gently. But so is everyone else. The trick is to see which lie was told last. That evening the air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes every sound seem louder. At precisely 8, Mrs. Larch left her house again, without her hat this time, as if some ceremony no longer required formal attire. From a discreet distance, Pubright and Malley followed her to the old schoolroom. She carried nothing. At the door, she paused, looked round once, then unlocked it with the same key she had claimed to have returned. Still tidy, murmured Pubright. The door closed behind her. 5 minutes passed. Then came a faint crackle, like paper burning. Pubright waited until the smell reached the lane. Then he nodded to Malley. They approached quietly. Inside, the room was lit by a single candle on a table. The widow stood before a small tin tray, watching as a pile of documents crumbled into black ash. "Good evening, Mrs. Larch," said Pubright gently. She started but did not cry out. "Inspector, you shouldn't be here. Nor should your late husband's will," he said softly. "But it appears to have kept you company until the end." She straightened her back. "It was a mistake, an old draft. It said things no one should read, about a woman in Nottingham." She flinched.
You know?
"I make a hobby of knowing things, Mrs. Larch." Her voice, when she spoke, was low but steady. He meant to leave her a portion, to make amends for something before our marriage.
I couldn't let that be known.
Not here, Pubright nodded slowly. So you and Mr. Gloss prepared a simpler version, the one the town could respect. Tears welled, but not for guilt.
He only helped me.
He said no one would be harmed. We burned the original last night, and tonight? The copy. Pubright looked at the ashes. You've been thorough. She met his eyes with quiet dignity. I only wanted peace. He studied her face a moment, then said, You'll have it, Mrs. Larch, but not the kind you expected. She gave a faint, sad smile.
Peace never is it?
Pubright closed his notebook. No, it's merely what's left after people finish tidying up. He nodded to Mally. Fetch Mr. Gloss. He ought to see the end of his handiwork. As they left the schoolroom, the candle still flickered beside the tray of ashes. On the table's edge sat a single drop of blue-black ink, unburned, unabsorbed, gleaming faintly in the light. Pubright paused and said quietly, Odd, isn't it? Ink lasts longer than truth. By Thursday afternoon, the whole of Flaxborough had reached the firm conclusion that the case of the missing will was practically over. No one knew why they thought so, but the tone with which it was said, relieved, slightly self-congratulatory, suggested that the town considered its moral hygiene restored. At the police station, however, Inspector Pubright was planning one more conversation. He disliked endings that tidied themselves. In his experience, they were never properly swept. He sent brief notes to Mrs. Larch, Mr. Gloss and Gerald Larch, requesting that they attend a short meeting to clarify certain administrative details. The location, the reading room of the Flaxborough Public Library. It was the most neutral room in town, hushed, respectable and incapable of melodrama. At 6 o'clock sharp, they assembled. Mrs. Larch arrived first, composed as always, her black gloves immaculate. Mr. Gloss followed, paler than his collar, and finally Gerald, still restless and defensive, his gaze darting between them both. Pubright entered last, hat in hand.
A faint air of apology about him. I'm most grateful to you all for indulging me, he said.
I dislike lingering puzzles. They keep the mind awake. He took a seat at the table, arranged his notes neatly, and looked at no one in particular. The matter of Mr. Arnold Larch's will, he began, has presented us with two questions: who removed it, and why?
I believe we have an answer to both, though it may not be the one anyone here would prefer. No one spoke.
The library clock ticked discreetly as if taking minutes. Pubright continued. We know now that Mr. Larch wrote several drafts of his will. The first, composed some months ago, included a small but significant bequest to a woman in Nottingham, a Miss Flora Dane. The second draft removed her name, but was never signed. The third, which we shall call the final version, was prepared with Mr. Gloss's assistance. Gloss shifted uneasily. Inspector, if I may— Of course, said Pubright, smiling. Correction is your speciality, I understand. Gloss coloured faintly and said nothing. The final version, Pubright went on, was, in essence, a collaboration between Mr. Gloss and Mrs. Larch. It simplified the estate, removed all reference to Miss Dane, and left everything to the widow, a more respectable outcome.
Though not a more honest one, Gerald's voice broke in. So it was forged.
Pubright regarded him mildly, altered certainly, but with an admirable sense of grammar. Mrs. Larch drew herself up. Inspector, I have already admitted that we destroyed the original. There was nothing criminal in that, merely merciful. Mercy, said Pubright softly, is often a matter of perspective. He turned to Gloss. You, Mr. Gloss, have told several small lies, none very serious by themselves. You said the will vanished from your strongbox. You said your clerk must have misplaced it. You implied a burglary. All false, of course, but delivered in such earnest tones that one hesitates to call them lies at all. Let us call them kindnesses, the solicitor swallowed. I thought it best not to alarm the lady. Quite right, said Pubright. And then you alarmed yourself instead. Hence the letter to Mrs. Larch, warning her to destroy the copy. Gloss blinked.
How did you know of that?
Pubright smiled gently. It came to us through the post office. The postmistress is quite incapable of resisting a dramatic envelope. A tiny sound, half laugh,
Half sob escaped Mrs. Larch. "You see," Pubright said.
The difficulty with all this careful tidying is that it left behind one very untidy person, the nephew. Gerald, you came to Flaxborough convinced someone was stealing your inheritance. You made inquiries, accused everyone, and wrote yourself a number of notes in that handsome silver-bound book of yours. Gerald flushed. What of it? One of your notes, pressed through onto the next page, reads, "Find the copy, not the original." You were right, though you didn't know it. There was indeed a copy, the one Mrs. Larch kept in the schoolroom. Gerald stared.
You mean you knew all along?"
Not all along, said Pubright. Only since you told me in your eagerness not to. He folded his hands on the table. The true irony, however, is that none of this affects the estate. You see, we've located another version of the will. Gloss looked up sharply.
"You what?"
Filed under parish records in the church safe. Mr. Larch appears to have made a duplicate, unsigned, but witnessed in blank by two vergers who, happily, remember him. It leaves the bulk of his estate to his wife and a modest sum to Miss Flora Dane in trust for services rendered. Very proper.
"Nothing scandalous at all." Mrs. Larch's face softened. Relief mingled with something like shame. "Then all this was for nothing?"
Not quite nothing, said Pubright. We've learned a good deal about affection and a little about courage.
"Also about ink?"
Yes, said Pubright with the faintest smile. Pelican blue-black. The solicitors, the widows, the nephews, the strangers, everyone used the same shade.
"It's as if the whole town had conspired to write the same story, only with different endings." He stood, adjusting his hat.
No charges will be brought. The will that remains will serve the law, and the law will serve the truth as much as it can be expected to. But I would advise you all to avoid late-night stationery in future. Mrs. Larch looked at him gratefully. You're very kind, Inspector. Not kind, said Pubright.
"Merely lazy. Paperwork exhausts me." He turned toward the door, then paused.
Oh, one last question, or purely out of curiosity. They all looked up. When you rewrote the will, Pubright said softly, whose idea was it to remove Miss Dane's name first? Yours, Mrs. Larch, or Mr. Gloss's? For a moment, silence. Then the widow's eyes flicked toward the solicitor, a brief, instinctive glance, too quick to recall. Pubright nodded politely. Thank you. That was all I needed. He stepped out into the corridor, where Mally waited. All tidy, sir? The sergeant asked. As tidy as human nature allows, said Pubright. Now let's write our report before someone edits it for style. And as they left the library, the three inside remained seated. The widow with her folded gloves, the solicitor staring at the table, the nephew gazing into the middle distance, each understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the truth had been discovered not by accusation, but by a single polite question. The following Monday dawned, with the peculiar brightness that follows days of
rain, on as though Flaxborough itself had been washed and ironed for public
decency. The case of the missing will was officially resolved, though the town preferred not to discuss the finer details. At the police station, Inspector Pubright was writing his final report, a document so modestly phrased that one might never suspect it concerned forgery, blackmail, or moral panic. Summary: mislaid testamentary document located. No further action required. Parties reconciled. Community restored to habitual condition of semi-virtue. He signed it neatly, blotted it, and leaned back with mild satisfaction. And so ends, he murmured. Another outbreak of honesty. Sergeant Mally, entering with 2 mugs of tea, nodded toward the stack of files.
"All finished, sir?"
Finished, said Pubright, and blessedly forgettable, which in this town is the surest mark of success, Mally grinned. The solicitor's back in business. People say he looks 10 years older. Ah, said Pubright.
"Conscience is marvellous for the complexion after it's done with you." "And the widow?"
She's taken the train to Nottingham.
Mally blinked.
To see the other woman? To deliver a letter, I suspect. Mrs. Larch is not the kind to leave debts, moral or otherwise. He took a sip of tea. If Miss Dane still lives there, she'll receive the money quietly, without scandal. And if she doesn't, well, the letter will serve as apology to the heir. Mally hesitated.
And the nephew?
Gone back to Lincoln. Wiser, if not wealthier. Possibly both. He left his notebook at the hotel. Uncharacteristic untidiness. I told them to keep it as lost property. Flaxborough's very short on literature. That afternoon, Pubright walked through the market square. The shops had resumed their unhurried commerce. The draper's window displayed new curtains with the same gravity that others reserved for coronations. Outside the Swan and Trumpet, Miss Teatley stood in conversation with Mrs. Parbury. They broke off respectfully as Pubright passed, then continued in tones of eager moderation. He caught only the words remarkable discretion and most civil police work. He smiled. Compliments in Flaxborough were like funerals, never spontaneous, but always well attended, crossing toward the church. He found the vicar tending the flower beds near the gate. "Good afternoon, Inspector," said the clergyman.
A merciful resolution, I gather.
"As merciful as can be arranged, Reverend. We've all learned a little humility." "Indeed?"
Yes, said Pubright.
"Mostly that the law exists to tidy up the bits conscience overlooks," the vicar chuckled. "And who tidies the law, Inspector?" "Ah," said Pubright, "that's what paperwork is for." He left the vicar to his roses and strolled on toward Church Row. Number 14 looked as neat and self-conscious as ever. Through the parlour window he could see the maid packing books into boxes. Tidy, careful movements, as though even the furniture were being prepared for a new chapter. He raised his hat slightly out of courtesy to the absent widow, and walked on. That evening a letter arrived at the station. The envelope was addressed to Inspector Pubright, Flaxborough Police, the handwriting precise and formal. Inside was a single sheet. "Dear Inspector, you were right about everything, though I imagine you knew that already. I am grateful for your discretion and for your silence in court and elsewhere. I have written to Miss Dane and sent her what my husband intended. It seems only fair that both of us, in our different ways, should keep faith with him at last. Please tell Mr. Gloss that his services are no longer required. He has done enough on my behalf. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Larch." Pubright folded the letter slowly. Then, after a moment's thought, he added a small note to his report. Addendum: widow now reconciled with the truth. Case concluded in civility. He placed it in the file, stamped it, closed, and locked the drawer. At 8:30, the inspector left the station and walked toward the river. The evening was mild. Lamps glowed like friendly eyes along the quay. Somewhere in the distance a piano played a hesitant waltz. He paused on the bridge, looking down at the dark water. In the reflection of the gaslight, the current shimmered faintly blue and black. The same shade, he thought, that had stained so many of the week's letters and lies. He smiled to himself. "The moral ink of Flaxborough," he murmured. "Neither true black nor honest blue, just comfortably in between." As he turned to go, he noticed a small object on the parapet, a silver fountain pen, its cap unscrewed, left behind like an exhausted accomplice. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, then placed it neatly into his pocket. "Evidence," he said softly, "or perhaps a souvenir." Back at the station the lights were dim. Pubright sat down once more at his desk, pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer, and began to write, not a report this time, but a few private lines in his tidy, angular script. Flaxborough, like most English towns, will survive the truth, provided it's told politely. The law is a patient listener, though not always an eloquent one. In the end, most crimes here are only misunderstandings with paperwork. He blotted the ink carefully, replaced the pen in his pocket, and closed the notebook. Then, with his usual quiet precision, he reached for the desk lamp and switched it off. The little circle of light faded, leaving only the faint gleam of the brass nameplate on his door, Inspector C.D. Pubright. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the clock on the wall resumed its steady ticking, indifferent to mysteries solved or unsolved. Flaxborough, beyond the windows, lay peacefully in its habitual twilight of respectability, waiting for its next scandal to arrive politely by post,